July 5, 1943, 0530 hours. The Kursk salient, Unteroffizier Werner Kreisler of the 6th Panzer Division pressed himself against the cold metal of his panzer, scanning the pink horizon through field glasses still misted with morning dew. In 12 minutes, Operation Citadel would begin, the largest tank offensive in German military history. 3,000 armored vehicles waited in formation, engines rumbling like distant thunder, ready to cut through the Soviet lines and reclaim the initiative on the Eastern Front. Kreisler had survived 2 years of the Russian campaign, Poland, France, the drive to Moscow, the frozen hell of the first winter, Stalingrad's distant echoes. He had learned to fear the Soviet T-3 for tanks, respect the Katyusha rockets, and hate the endless mud that swallowed German vehicles whole. But what he heard at 0532 made his blood freeze in his veins, a low grinding drone from the east, not the sharp whine of fighters, not the heavy throb of bombers. Something different, something guttural and mechanical, like 1,000 sewing machines amplified through megaphones. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising in intensity until the air itself vibrated. Then he saw them, emerging from the morning haze like a biblical plague, flying so low their propeller wash flattened the summer grass, wave after wave of dark angular shapes. They came in formations of 8, 12, 20 aircraft, their silhouettes unlike anything in the Luftwaffe. Recognition manuals, hunched, brutal. Someone screamed, ground attack aircraft. But these weren't like the Stukas that had terrorized Poland and France. These machines seemed heavier, more purposeful, their approach lacking the diving theatrics of German aircraft. They came straight and level, impossibly low, their engines producing that horrible grinding roar that would haunt German soldiers. Nightmares for years. The first rockets streaked from their wings. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, but Kreisler would remember it for the rest of his life. Explosions walked through the panzer formations. Fuel tanks detonated. Ammunition cooked off inside armored hulls. The rockets were followed by cannon fire, not the light chattering of machine guns, but deep percussive hammering that punched through engine decks and turret rings. Men scrambled from burning vehicles, their uniforms on fire, only to be cut down by strafing runs. Through the chaos, Kreisler glimpsed something impossible. A nearby 20mm flak gun scored direct hits on one of the attacking aircraft. He saw the tracer's impact, saw pieces fly from the wing and fuselage. The Soviet plane wobbled, trailed smoke, then steadied, completed its attack run, and flew away toward the east, climbing slowly but inexorably out of range. What are those things? A young grenadier shouted, his voice cracking with terror. An older Feldwebel, a veteran of the 1941 advance, answered without taking his eyes from the sky. The Russians called them Ilyushin. We call them Schwarzer Tod. Black Death, in 12 minutes before Operation Citadel had even officially begun. 37 German tanks were burning. 14 more were damaged beyond immediate repair. Over 200 soldiers were dead or wounded. The Soviet aircraft, having delivered their payload of destruction, disappeared into the morning haze as quickly as they had arrived. The offensive would continue. The tanks would advance. But in those 90 seconds of fire and thunder, the 6th Panzer Division had received its first lesson in a new kind of warfare, one where the ground belonged to whoever controlled the sky, and the sky belonged to the Schwarzer Tod. What Unteroffizier Kreisler couldn't know, huddled beside his scarred panzer, for in the smoke and screaming, was that he had just witnessed the weapon that would bleed the Wehrmacht white across 1,000 kilometers of Soviet soil. The aircraft that German soldiers would come to fear more than tanks, more than artillery, more than the endless waves of Soviet infantry, the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, the most produced military aircraft in history, the flying tank that couldn't be killed, the instrument of vengeance that would pursue the Wehrmacht from Stalingrad to Berlin. From the Volga to the Reichstag, 36,183 of them would be built. They would fly over 600,000 combat sorties. They would destroy more German armor than any other weapon system in the Soviet arsenal. And their crews, flying missions with a life expectancy measured in weeks, would suffer casualties that defied comprehension while becoming the most feared aviators on the Eastern Front. This is the story of the aircraft that Germany mocked as a cement bomber, a crude Soviet machine incapable of matching German engineering, It is the story of how that mockery turned to concern, concern to fear, and fear to the kind of primal terror that made hardened Wehrmacht veterans weep at the sound of grinding engines. The Germans laughed at the Il-2 in 1941. By 1945, there were no Germans left on the Eastern Front to laugh. The Ilyushin IL-2 was born from failure and desperation. In the spring of 1938, Soviet aviation designer Sergey Vladimirovich Ilyushin stood before the Military Council of the People's Commissariat of Defense in Moscow, presenting a proposal that his colleagues considered suicidal, while other designers competed to build faster fighters and higher-flying bombers. Ilyushin argued for something that contradicted every principle of contemporary aircraft design. He wanted to build a flying tank. Speed will not protect a ground attack aircraft, Ilyushin explained to the skeptical generals. Altitude will not protect it. Maneuverability will not protect it. Only armor will protect it. The concept was radical. Conventional wisdom held that armor belonged on tanks, not aircraft. Every kilogram of protective steel meant reduced speed, climb rate, and range. The few armored aircraft attempted by other nations had proven sluggish and ineffective. German aviation doctrine specifically rejected the concept, focusing instead on the dive bomber fast, precise, and unarmored, relying on speed and surprise rather than protection. But Ilyushin had studied the losses of Soviet ground attack aircraft in the Spanish Civil War and the border conflicts with Japan. He had seen the statistics that the Kremlin tried to hide. Over 60% of Polikarpov, R-25 and RZ attack aircraft were being lost to ground fire. Pilots were dying not from enemy fighters, but from rifle bullets, machine gun fire, and light flak. A single round through the engine coolant system, the fuel tank, or the cockpit was enough to destroy an aircraft. Ilyushin's solution was elegant in its brutality. Instead of adding armor plates to a conventional airframe, he would make armor the airframe itself. The pilot, engine, fuel tanks, and critical systems would be enclosed in a shell of steel plate that served both structural and protective functions. The armor would not be additional weight, it would replace the weight of conventional aluminum. Structure. The TSK B-55 prototype, designated BSH-2 Bronirovanny Sturmovik, armored attacker, first flew on October 2, 1939. Test pilot Vladimir Kokonaki, one of the Soviet Union's most experienced aviators, later described that first flight. It flew like a truck with wings, heavy on the controls, reluctant to climb, impossible to throw around like a fighter. But when we landed and I examined the airframe, I understood what Ilyushin had created. This was not an aircraft meant to dance, it was meant to survive. The aircraft's vital components were enclosed in 4 to 12 millimeters of steel armor, with the thickest protection surrounding the engine, pilot, and fuel system. The armor shell weighed 700 kilograms, nearly one-third of the empty aircraft weight. No fighter in the world carried such protection. No bomber had ever been designed around the concept of absorbing punishment rather than avoiding it. The original design featured a two-seat configuration, with a rear gunner to protect against fighter attacks from behind. But when the first production aircraft, now designated IL-2, entered service in the spring of 1941, the rear gunner position had been removed. This decision would haunt the Soviet Air Force for years. The reason was weight. The two-seat version was slower, had reduced range, and carried fewer weapons. Military planners, still thinking in terms of the Spanish Civil War, believed that speed and forward firepower mattered more than rear defense. Fighter escorts would protect the Sturmoviks from enemy aircraft. The ground attack planes needed only to survive ground fire, and for that, the armor was sufficient. They were catastrophically wrong. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the IL-2 force numbered only 249 aircraft, barely enough to equip a handful of regiments. Within the first week, over half were destroyed, mostly on the ground. The Luftwaffe's opening strikes annihilated Soviet airfields with precision that shocked the world. Thousands of aircraft were reduced to burning wreckage without ever leaving the ground. The IL-2 South that did fly found themselves facing a nightmare scenario their designers had not anticipated. Without adequate fighter escort, most Soviet fighters had been destroyed in the first days. The single-seat Sturmoviks were helpless against German fighters attacking from behind. The rear armor plate that protected the pilot from ground fire was useless. Against Messerschmitt 109s diving from above, German pilots quickly learned to approach from the 6 o'clock position, where the Il-2s fixed forward. Armament couldn't reach them. The slaughter was systematic. Who would become one of the Luftwaffe's most successful IL-2 killers with 23 Sturmovik victories, described the early encounters with professional detachment. The Russian attack aircraft were absurdly easy targets in 1941. They flew in tight formations, straight and level, with no rear gunners to threaten us. We would approach from behind, slightly below, to avoid their field of view, and fire into the oil cooler beneath the engine. Even their famous armor couldn't protect that. One good burst, and the engine would seize within minutes. We called it shooting fish in a barrel. German pilots developed a grudging respect for the IL-2's toughness even as they slaughtered its crews. Major Gunther Raoul, who would become the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, encountered IL-2 South during the opening weeks of Barbarossa. You could hit them with everything you had, and they would keep flying. I once put over 100 rounds of 7.92 millimeters into a Sturmovik at close range. The pilot should have been killed 10 times over. The aircraft should have been falling debris. Instead, it continued its attack run, dropped its bombs on a supply column, and flew away trailing smoke. We recovered the wreck 3 weeks later when our troops advanced past the crash site. The pilot had bled to death from his wounds, but only after flying 40 kilometers to reach Soviet lines. Despite their losses, the IL South that did survive long enough to attack proved devastatingly effective. Their weapons battery, 2 20mm Shavak cannon and 2 7.62mm SKA's machine guns, supplemented by rockets and bombs, could shred German vehicles, troops, and supply lines. The RSA-2 rockets, while inaccurate, created psychological terror among German soldiers who had never faced aerial rocket attack. The mathematics of those early months were horrifying. IL-2 two regiments suffered casualty rates exceeding 50% per month. Pilots averaged fewer than 10 combat missions before being killed or wounded. The single-seat configuration was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. But the production lines kept running, and Sergey Ilyushin was already working on the solution. In late 1941, as German forces approached Moscow and the Soviet Union faced extinction, a telegram arrived at the Ilyushin Design Bureau from Joseph Stalin himself. The message would become one of the most quoted documents in Soviet aviation history. A perfect encapsulation of the desperate importance placed on the IL-2. The IL-2 is needed by our Red Army now like air, like bread. I demand more. This is my final warning. The phrase needed like air, like bread became the unofficial motto of the Sturmovik program. Factory workers painted it on the walls of production facilities. Pilots invoked it before missions. Propagandists used it to justify the staggering resources poured into IL-2 production even as Soviet citizens starved. The production effort that followed was one of the most remarkable industrial achievements in history. In October 1941, with German forces visible from the outskirts of Moscow, the Soviet government ordered the evacuation of entire aircraft factories, not just equipment and materials, but complete production lines, thousands of workers, and their families. Factory No. 18 in Voronezh, one of the primary IL-2 producers, was dismantled in 3 weeks. Over 5,000 railroad cars transported machinery, tools, and personnel 1,200 kilometers east to Kubyshev, beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers reassembled production lines in unfinished buildings, sometimes working in the open under canvas tarps in temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Production resumed within 6 weeks. By December 1941, new IL-2 South were rolling off the line at Kubyshev. Even as workers' fingers froze, 2 metal tools and fuel lines had to be warmed over fires to remain. Liquid. Nikolai Dmitriev, a young engineer who helped relocate Factory No. 8, later recalled the conditions. We worked 16-hour shifts, sometimes 20. There was never enough food, never enough sleep, never enough heat. Men and women collapsed at their stations and were carried to the side so work could continue. When someone died, and many died that first winter, we buried them in the snow and kept building aircraft. There was no choice. The telegram said like air, like bread. We understood what that meant. If we stopped building Sturmoviks, the Germans would reach Kubyshev too. There would be nowhere left to retreat. The production numbers that followed defied Western comprehension. In 1941, Soviet factories produced 1,542 IL-2 South. In 1942, despite evacuation and reorganization, that number rose to 8,229. In 1943, it reached 11,193. By 1944, IL-2 South and its successor, the IL-10, were being completed at a rate of over 1,200 per month, more than 40 per day. At peak production, Factory No. 18 alone was completing 1 IL-2 every hour. Factory No. 1 in Kubyshev matched this rate. Factory No. 381 in Nizhny Tagil added a third stream. Smaller facilities throughout the Urals produced components and subassemblies that fed the main production lines. The total would reach 36,183 aircraft, more than any other military aircraft in history, before or since. But production numbers meant nothing if the aircraft couldn't survive combat. And in 1942, the IL-2's fundamental flaw was killing pilots. Faster than factories could train replacements. The solution came from the pilots themselves. Flight crews returning from missions begged for rear gunners to protect them from German fighters. Mechanics in forward units improvised gunner positions, cutting holes in the rear fuselage and mounting salvaged machine guns on crude pivots. These modifications were unauthorized, aerodynamically disastrous, and often deadly, but they saved lives. By spring 1942, Ilyushin had redesigned the aircraft with a proper two-seat configuration. The IL-2M featured an extended cockpit with a rear-facing gunner armed with a 12.7 mm UBT machine gun. The gunner's position was partially armored, though less protected than the pilot's station, a compromise. Forced by weight limitations, the addition of the rear gunner changed everything. German pilots who had grown accustomed to easy kills suddenly faced return fire. The heavy UBT machine gun, firing 700 rounds per minute, could destroy a Messerschmitt at close range. Approaching an IL-2 from behind became a dangerous proposition, forcing Luftwaffe fighters to develop new tactics that cost precious time and fuel. Hauptmann Hartmann Grasser of Jagdgeschwader 52, one of the leading fighter aces on the Eastern Front, described the impact when the two-seat Sturmoviks appeared. Our losses increased immediately. The rear gunners were brave men. They had no armor, no parachutes, nothing but that machine gun between them and our cannon. But they fought like demons. I saw many good German pilots fall to those rear guns. The easy hunting was over. Now, killing a Sturmovik meant risking your own life. The rear gunners paid a terrible price for their role, flying without the armor that protected the pilot. They suffered casualty rates nearly twice as high as their partners in the front seat. Their position was so dangerous that gunner assignments were sometimes used as punishment for disciplinary infractions. Yet volunteers never stopped coming forward. Air gunner Sergeant Yevgeny Mikhailovich Brisov, who survived 87 combat missions as an IL-2 rear gunner, explained, "We knew we would probably die. Everyone knew, but I would rather die fighting with a gun in my hands than sit helplessly while some German put bullets in my back. At least now we could shoot back. At least now they learned to fear us too." By late 1942, IL-2 losses to fighters had dropped by 40%, combined with improved training, better tactics, and increasing fighter escort availability. The Sturmovik was transforming from a flying coffin into a survivable combat platform. The armor that Ilyushin had built into the design began demonstrating its worth in spectacular fashion. Aircraft returned from missions with damage that would have destroyed any other plane. Pilots walked away from crashes that should have been fatal. The IL-2's reputation for indestructibility grew with each passing month, and the Germans began to notice. The IL-2's transformation from victim to predator began in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. By October 1942, the battle for the city had devolved into apocalyptic street fighting. German forces held 90% of Stalingrad's ruins, but Soviet troops clung to pockets of resistance along the Volga's western bank. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was grinding forward meter by meter, confident that final victory was weeks away. What Paulus didn't know, what German intelligence had catastrophically failed to detect, was that the Soviets were massing forces for Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment that would trap the entire Sixth Army. Air power would be critical to the operation's success. The Soviets concentrated 17 air armies in the Stalingrad sector, including over 1,000 IL-2 Sturmovik. For the first time since the war's beginning, Soviet aircraft would outnumber German planes over a major battle. On November 19, 1942, the offensive began, and the IL-2 regiments delivered a masterclass in ground attack warfare that would terrify the Wehrmacht for the remainder of the war. Major Heinrich Eberbach, operations officer for the 29th Motorized Division, was positioned north of Stalingrad when the Soviet offensive struck. His after-action report, captured by advancing Soviet forces in January 1943, described the Il-2 attacks in stark terms. The Russian ground attack aircraft appeared in numbers we had never before encountered. Formations of 30, 40, even 50 Sturmoviks struck our positions continuously from dawn until dusk. Our flak batteries were overwhelmed. For every aircraft we shot down, 3 more appeared. They attacked in waves, the first dropping bombs, the second firing rockets, the third strafing with cannon and machine gun. By the time the formation had passed, nothing remained but burning vehicles and dead men. Our Romanian allies simply broke and ran. I cannot blame them. I wanted to run myself. The concentrated Il-2 attacks shattered the Romanian 3rd and 4th, armies holding the flanks of the German position. These Axis allies, equipped with obsolete anti-aircraft weapons and lacking air cover, were defenseless against the Sturmovik onslaught. Within 48 hours, gaps 80 kilometers wide had been torn in the German lines. What happened next became legend. On November 23, 1942, Soviet armored spearheads from the north and south linked up at completing the encirclement of the German Sixth Army. 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped in the Stalingrad pocket with inadequate supplies and no hope of ground relief. The Luftwaffe promised to sustain the pocket through an air bridge. Field Marshal Hermann Göring personally assured Hitler that his aircraft would deliver the 300 tons of supplies needed daily. To keep the Sixth Army alive, the IL-2 regiments made this impossible. Soviet Sturmoviks established a virtual siege around the pocket, attacking German transport aircraft at their bases, along their routes, and over the landing fields. The Roof-52 transport planes, slow and poorly armed, were slaughtered by the dozens, even when German fighters managed to escort supply flights. Il-2 South struck the airfields as transports landed, destroying aircraft on the ground. Lieutenant Ivan Ivanovich Piani, piloting on IL-2 of the 672nd Attack Aviation Regiment, participated in a December 1942 raid on the Potomnik airfield inside the pocket. His combat report, preserved in Soviet archives, describes the chaos. We approached at 50 meters altitude, below German radar detection. The airfield was crowded with Roof-52s, at least 40 aircraft waiting to unload or refuel. Our formation of 12 Sturmoviks attacked simultaneously. I released my bombs on a group of transports and then strafed the fuel storage area. The explosions were immediate and enormous. Secondary detonations continued for several minutes as ammunition and fuel cooked off. On our withdrawal, I counted at least 20 aircraft burning on the ground. The Germans fired at us from every direction, but the armor held. I took 17 hits on that mission. Nothing penetrated the cockpit. Over the course of the Stalingrad airlift, the Luftwaffe lost 488 transport aircraft, a third of Germany's total transport capacity. The IL-2 regiments were responsible for approximately 40% of these losses. The air bridge never came close to delivering the required supplies. German soldiers starved, froze, and ran out of ammunition while waiting for aircraft that couldn't get through. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the remnants of the Sixth Army. 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Most would never return. The Il-2 had not won Stalingrad alone. The victory belonged to the millions of Soviet soldiers who fought and died in the city's ruins, to the tanks and artillery that shattered German lines, to the generals who planned Operation Uranus. But the Sturmovik had proven what it could do when deployed in mass. And German soldiers had learned a new fear in the aftermath of Stalingrad. Il-2 units developed the tactic that would become their signature and their victims' nightmare: They called it the Circle of Death. The concept was simple in theory, devastating in practice. When attacking a defended target, IL-2 formations would establish a circular pattern around the objective, like a carousel of destruction. Aircraft would peel off from the circle one at a time, making attack runs on the target, then rejoining the formation on the opposite side. This created a continuous stream of attackers. As one aircraft completed its pass, another was already beginning its dive. For German forces caught in the circle, there was no respite. The attacks came without pause, without mercy, from constantly changing directions. Flak guns couldn't track fast enough. Vehicles couldn't escape. Troops couldn't stay in the open to fight or hide in cover to avoid the next pass. Feldwebel Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders and a survivor of hundreds of combat engagements, experienced the Circle of Death near Vitebsk in June 1944. His memoir, Tigers in the Mud, describes the encounter. "We heard them before we saw them, that grinding engine sound that froze your blood. Then they appeared, at least 20 Sturmoviks, and they began circling our column like vultures over a dying animal. There was nothing to do but scatter and hope. The first one dove rockets streaking from its wings. A half-track exploded. Before the smoke cleared, another was attacking from the opposite direction. Then another. Then another. It was like being trapped in hell's carousel. I ordered my driver into a small wood, hoping the trees would mask us. We sat for an hour, listening to the explosions, watching the smoke rise from our dying column. When the aircraft finally left, we emerged to find half our vehicles destroyed. This was not combat. This was extermination. The Circle of Death exploited every advantage the Il-2 possessed. The aircraft's heavy armor allowed pilots to press attacks through defensive fire that would have destroyed fighters. The rear gunners discouraged German aircraft from intervening. The formation's continuous nature prevented targets from escaping during lulls in the attack. Most importantly, the tactic was psychologically devastating. German soldiers who survived Il-2 attacks reported symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as combat stress: reaction, tremors, nightmares, inability to function when aircraft engines were heard. The Wehrmacht's medical services documented what they termed Schlacht, Pflegerkt, attack aircraft, fear, a condition that rendered otherwise effective. Soldiers unable to perform their duties. Dr. Werner Hartenstein, a German military psychiatrist assigned to Army Group Center, compiled a report on the condition in late 1943. The psychological impact of the Russian ground attack aircraft exceeds that of any other weapon system we have encountered. Artillery bombardment, however intense, eventually ends. Tank attacks can be repelled or evaded, but the Sturmoviks create a feeling of absolute helplessness that breaks men's spirits. The continuous circling attack pattern is particularly damaging. Soldiers report feeling hunted like animals and describe the experience as waiting to be selected for death. Many develop physical symptoms: vomiting, paralysis, loss of bowel control at the mere sound of approaching aircraft engines. I recommend immediate development of countermeasures, not merely for tactical reasons, but because these attacks are destroying the fighting capacity of our ground forces. No effective countermeasures were ever developed. German attempts to intercept IL-2 formations faced the fundamental problem of numbers. Even at the height of the Luftwaffe strength in the East, there were never enough fighters to protect every potential target. And as Soviet production continued to outpace German losses, the disparity only grew. The 20mm and 37mm flak guns that protected German columns could and did shoot down Sturmoviks. But the IL-2's armor often allowed damaged aircraft to complete their attack runs before going down. Even dying, the Sturmoviks killed. Hauptmann Rudolf Witzig, a flak battery commander who claimed 14 IL-2 kills, described the frustration. Shooting down a Sturmovik meant nothing if he still dropped his bombs on your position. I once hit an IL-2 with 6 consecutive 20mm rounds at close range. I could see pieces flying off the aircraft. The pilot was clearly wounded. The aircraft was trailing smoke and flying erratic, but he held his course, released his rockets into our battery, and killed 8 of my men before crashing 500 meters away. We examined the wreck later. The pilot had taken a shell fragment through the shoulder and bled to death at the controls, but he finished his attack. What do you do against men like that? The Il-2's legendary survivability wasn't propaganda. It was documented fact recorded in after-action reports, combat damage assessments, and the testimony of pilots who returned from missions that should have killed them. Senior Lieutenant Anna Alexandrovna Yegorova flew 277 combat missions in Il-2 Sturmoviks, one of the highest totals for any Soviet attack pilot, and remarkable for a woman in a male-dominated combat arm. Her aircraft was hit by enemy fire on virtually every mission. She was wounded 4 times. On August 22, 1944, her luck finally ran out, but even then, the Il-2's armor saved her life in a way that defied probability. Yegorova's regiment was attacking German positions near Warsaw when her aircraft was caught in concentrated flak. Multiple shells struck the Sturmovik in rapid succession. The engine was shattered. The fuel tank ignited. The rear gunner was killed instantly. Yegorova herself was wounded in the legs by shrapnel, with her aircraft on fire and losing altitude. Yegorova attempted to crash land in Soviet-controlled territory. She didn't make it. The Il-2 came down in German lines, smashing through trees before coming to rest in a forest clearing. What happened next was documented in German military records captured after the war. Wehrmacht soldiers, approaching the wreck, expected to find but instead, they found Anna Yegorova, badly burned and barely conscious, still alive in the armored cockpit. The fire that consumed the wooden rear fuselage had been stopped by the steel armor shell surrounding the pilot's position. The shell that killed her gunner had been blocked by the armored headrest behind her seat. The crash forces that should have broken her spine had been absorbed by the reinforced cockpit structure. Yegorova was taken prisoner. She spent 8 months in German captivity, including time in the Kustrin concentration camp. Before being liberated by Soviet forces in 1945, upon her return, instead of receiving recognition for her extraordinary combat record, she was arrested by the NKVD on suspicion of collaboration, the standard Soviet treatment of returned prisoners of war. Only in 1965, after years of campaigning by fellow veterans, was Anna Yegorova's record officially rehabilitated. She was finally awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. On May 6, 1965, more than 20 years after her 277th combat mission, her survival was remarkable, but not unique. The Soviet archives contain hundreds of reports of Il-2 South returning from combat with damage that defied engineering analysis. Aircraft with more than 500 bullet holes. Aircraft with entire tail sections shot away. Aircraft with cylinders blasted out of engines that somehow continued to function. Major Georgy Timofeyevich, who would later become a cosmonaut and hero of the Soviet Union twice over, flew 186 combat missions in Il-2 aircraft. He was shot down 3 times. Each time, the armor saved his life. The aircraft would be destroyed around you, Beregovoy recalled in a 1975 interview, but that armored shell kept you alive. I once returned with 47 holes in my aircraft from a single mission. My mechanic counted them while I stood smoking a cigarette, trying to stop my hands from shaking. He said it looked like a cheese grater. I asked him how long to repair it. He said 3 days. 3 days later, I flew it again. Same aircraft, 47 patches welded over the holes. It flew perfectly. You could not kill these machines. The Germans documented the phenomenon with characteristic thoroughness. Luftwaffe intelligence compiled reports on recovered Il-2 wrecks, attempting to identify vulnerabilities. Their conclusion, reached by mid-19, was sobering. The Sturmovik's armor system provides near-complete protection against rifle-caliber weapons and significant protection against 20mm cannon fire. The armored areas can only be reliably penetrated by 30mm or larger caliber weapons at close range. The aircraft's oil cooler, positioned beneath the engine cowling, remains the primary vulnerability. However, even catastrophic oil system damage does not produce immediate engine failure. Pilots frequently have sufficient time to complete attack runs before oil starvation causes engine seizure. Recommendation: engage IL to aircraft only with heavy weapons. Standard fighter armament is insufficient for reliable kills. This recommendation was largely ignored because Germany lacked sufficient heavy weapons to implement it. The 30mm Mk108 cannon that could reliably destroy Sturmoviks was in chronic short supply, prioritized for bomber interception. Most German fighters continued to carry 20mm weapons that could damage but not destroy the armored attackers. The IL-2's durability became part of its psychological power. German soldiers learned that shooting at Sturmoviks often accomplished nothing. The aircraft absorbed the hits and kept coming. This perception that the enemy was invincible amplified the terror beyond what tactical reality might justify. And then came KURSK. Operation Citadel. The German offensive at Kursk in July 1943 was supposed to restore the initiative on the Eastern Front. Instead, it became the graveyard of the Panzerwaffe and the proving ground for IL-2 mass. Attack doctrine: both sides knew the offensive was coming. German preparations were visible for months. The Soviets used the time to construct the deepest defensive works in military history. 8 defensive lines stretching back 150 kilometers, containing over 3,000 kilometers of trenches, 500,000 mines, and 20,000 artillery pieces. They also massed unprecedented air power. 2,900 Soviet aircraft faced 2,000 German planes. Among the Soviet force were over 1,000 IL-2 Sturmoviks, organized into specialized anti-tank regiments, equipped with the new PTAB cluster bombs. That the PTAB protivotankovaya, or anti-tank aviation bomb, was a deceptively simple weapon that would prove devastating against German armor. Each PTAB weighed only 1.5 kilograms, but contained a shaped charge capable of penetrating 70 millimeters of armor, sufficient to defeat the top armor of any German tank. Including the Tiger, a single IL-2 could carry up to 280 PTABs, in special dispensers mounted under the wings and fuselage. When released, the bomblets scattered across an area roughly 70 meters wide by 200 meters long. A formation of 12 Sturmoviks could saturate an area the size of a football field with over 3,000 anti-tank bombs. The Germans had nothing comparable. They had no warning of the weapon's existence. And when the IL-2 regiments employed PTABs en masse at Kursk, the results were catastrophic. On July 7, 1943, the 16th Air Army launched a concentrated attack against the 9th Panzer Division's assembly area near Paneri, 160 IL-2 South, carrying a combined total of over 40,000 PTAs, struck the division as it prepared to resume its advance. Major Helmut Ritgen, operations officer for the 9th Panzer Division, survived the attack. There was no warning. The first indication was the sound of many aircraft engines approaching from the east. Then they were on ES, more Sturmoviks than I had ever seen in one place. They came in waves, very low, releasing some kind of small bomb that fell like rain. Hundreds, thousands of small explosions covering the entire assembly area. Tanks that had survived years of combat, that had withstood direct hits from anti-tank guns, were destroyed by these tiny bombs falling on their thin top armor. In 20 minutes, we lost 40 tanks and armored vehicles, 41 division. One attack, the offensive capability of the 9th Panzer Division was essentially destroyed. We had to be withdrawn from the line and reconstituted, all because of those little bombs we had never seen before. German tank crews quickly learned to fear attacks from above more than any ground threat. The Panthers and Tigers that were supposed to achieve breakthrough proved vulnerable to weapons that cost a fraction of what it took to build them. A PTAB that cost perhaps 20 rubles could destroy a Tiger that required 300,000 Reichsmarks and months of factory labor to produce. The economics were inescapable. Over the course of the Battle of Kursk, IL-2, 2 regiments claimed the destruction of over 1,500 German tanks and armored vehicles. Even accounting for the usual inflation of combat claims, the actual number was staggering. German records acknowledged the loss of approximately 1,200 armored vehicles at Kursk from all causes combined. A substantial percentage fell to air attack. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Germany would never again launch a major offensive. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht would spend the remaining 2 years of the war in continuous retreat, pursued by tank armies, artillery barrages, and the endless, grinding roar of Sturmovik engines. By 1944, the Il-2 had achieved a dominance over the Eastern Front that no other ground attack aircraft would match in any theater of World War II. The numbers told the story. Over 15,000 Sturmoviks were in frontline service. Soviet factories were producing more IL-2 South each month than Germany produced fighters. Training programs were graduating thousands of attack pilots annually, each with more flying hours than their German counterparts, and the tactics had evolved to terrifying sophistication. Attack aviation regiments operated in close coordination with advancing ground forces. Forward air controllers, positioned with tank spearheads, could summon Sturmovik strikes within minutes. The IL-2 South hunted ahead of Soviet advances, destroying German artillery positions before they could be brought to bear, annihilating supply columns before they could deliver ammunition, slaughtering headquarters units before they could coordinate defense. Operation Bagram, the Soviet offensive that destroyed Army Group Center in summer 1944, demonstrated the IL-2's role in combined arms warfare at its deadliest between June 23 and August 19, 1944. Soviet forces advanced 600 kilometers, liberating Belarusia and eastern Poland. Army Group Center, which had held the central sector of the Eastern Front since 1941, ceased to exist as a fighting force. 28 German divisions were destroyed. Over 350,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, losses exceeding those at Stalingrad. The IL-2 regiments flew over 77,000 sorties during Bagram. They struck every major road junction, every bridge, every concentration of German troops attempting to establish defensive lines. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. General Major Hans Jordan, commanding the remnants of the 9th Army during the withdrawal, described the situation in a report to Army Group Headquarters. Movement by day is impossible. The Russian Sturmoviks appear within minutes of any column forming on the roads. We have lost more vehicles to air attack than to ground combat. The men's morale is at breaking point. They hear aircraft engines and scatter into the forests like frightened animals. Unit cohesion is disintegrating. I must report that the 9th Army no longer exists as an effective fighting force. We are a mob of fugitives hunted from the sky. The psychological dominance was total. German soldiers developed elaborate concealment measures, traveling only at night, dispersing vehicles under tree cover, covering equipment with branches and camouflage netting. None of it was sufficient. The Sturmoviks found them anyway. The pilots themselves became celebrities in the Soviet Union. Their faces appeared on propaganda posters. Their exploits filled newspaper columns. The title Hero of the Soviet Union was awarded to IL-2 pilots. More than any other category of aviator, some became legends. Talgat Yakubekovich Bageldin, a Kazakh pilot who flew 305 combat missions, was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union twice, one of only 115 people to receive the medal twice during the war. He was credited with destroying 37 tanks, 53 trucks, 2 aircraft on the ground, and 3 locomotives. He was wounded 3 times. His aircraft was shot down twice. Both times, he survived and returned to combat. Nelson Georgievich Stepanyan, an Armenian pilot, flew 293 missions and sank 13 German ships, including a destroyer and 2 submarines. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union twice before being killed in action on December 14, 1944. During an attack on a German convoy, his IL-2 was hit by flak and crashed into the sea. He was 30 years old. These were the men and women who became the Schwarzer Tod. Behind the combat statistics lay an industrial reality that guaranteed German defeat. Soviet Union produced 36,183 IL-2 and IL-10 aircraft between 1941 and 1,945. This number exceeded the total combined production of all German ground attack and close support aircraft for the entire war. It exceeded the total production of Mi-109s in some calculations. It was, simply, the largest production run of any military aircraft in history. Each IL-2 required approximately 8,000 man-hours to produce. The Mikulin AM-38 engine that powered the aircraft required another 3,000 man-hours. The weapons, instruments, armor plate, and other components added thousands more, multiplied by 36,183 aircraft. The total represented over 300 million man-hours of labor, the equivalent of 100,000 workers. Laboring for 3 years without rest, the resources consumed were equally staggering. Each IL-2 required approximately 3,500 kilograms of aluminum, 1,200 kilograms of steel, 400 kilograms of copper, and other non-ferrous metals. The aircraft consumed 200 kilograms of rubber for tires, hoses, and seals. It required 15 square meters of plexiglass for the cockpit canopy. Multiply these figures by 36,183 aircraft, and the totals approach incomprehensibility. 126,000 tons of aluminum, 43,000 tons of steel, 14,000 tons of copper, 7,200 tons of rubber, 543,000 square meters of plexiglass. All of this was accomplished by a nation that had lost 40% of its population and 60% of its industrial capacity to German occupation. Who built these aircraft were predominantly women. By 1943, females comprised over 60% of the Soviet aviation industry workforce. Many were teenagers who had never seen a factory before the war. They learned to rivet, weld, and machine parts to tolerances measured in hundreds of millimeters. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. For wages that barely covered food rations, Valentina, a 17-year-old who began working at Factory No. 18 in 1942, recalled the conditions. We slept in the factory because there was no transportation home. 4 hours of sleep, then back to the line. When your hands were too cold to hold the tools, you warmed them over a brazier for 1 minute, then went back to work. We all had stories of girls who had lost fingers to frostbite or machinery, but we kept building. Every aircraft we finished was another knife in the fascist heart. That's what we told ourselves. Another knife, until there were enough knives to cut out their heart entirely. The ammunition consumed by IL-2 operations required its own industrial ecosystem. Each Sturmovik carried 300 rounds of 23mm cannon ammunition, 1,500 rounds of 7.62mm machine gun ammunition, and varying quantities of rockets and bombs. A single sortie might expend 5,000 rounds of combined ammunition, with over 600,000 IL-2 sorties flown during the war. Total ammunition expenditure exceeded 3 billion rounds. This required dozens of ammunition factories, thousands of workers, millions of tons of brass, steel, and explosives. The logistics of moving this ammunition from factories to forward airfields required additional thousands of trucks, trains, and support personnel. The fuel requirements were equally enormous. Each IL-2 consumed approximately 300 liters of aviation fuel per sortie. 600,000 sorties meant 180 million liters of fuel, enough to fill 1,800 kilometers of pipeline, or 4,500 railroad tank cars. All of this, the aircraft, ammunition, fuel, parts, tools had to be produced while fighting a war of survival against the most effective military machine in European history. The Germans understood what was happening. Intelligence reports from 1943 onward documented Soviet production capabilities with growing alarm. Staff officers calculated the production ratios and reached inescapable conclusions. General Lieutenant Hermann Pl, writing the Luftwaffe's official history of the Eastern Front, summarized the situation by 1943. We were losing the production war decisively. For every Sturmovik we shot down, the Soviets built 2 more. Our pilots were exhausted, our fuel supplies dwindling, our aircraft factories under constant bombardment from the West. The Soviets had moved their factories beyond our reach and were outproducing us in every category. The mathematics guaranteed our defeat. We continued fighting, but the outcome was inevitable. We were being buried under an avalanche of steel and fire, and the Sturmoviks were the sharp edge of that avalanche. The IL-2's final campaign was its most devastating dot. In April 1945, Soviet forces launched the assault on Berlin. Over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 41,600 artillery pieces were committed to the operation. Supporting them were 7,500 aircraft, including 2,900 IL-2 and IL-10. Sturmoviks. The density of ground attack aviation was unprecedented. Entire air armies were assigned sectors barely 20 kilometers wide. Sturmoviks operated in continuous relays, with formations taking off even as returning aircraft landed to rearm and refuel. What remained of the Luftwaffe was swept from the skies in days. German fighters, short of fuel and pilots, could barely contest Soviet air supremacy. The skies over Berlin belonged to the Red Air Force, and the Sturmoviks owned the ground. Generalmajor Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense, described the situation in his final report. The Russian ground attack aircraft operate without interference over the entire city. They attack every vehicle, every concentration of troops, every building suspected of containing resistance. Our anti-aircraft defenses are exhausted. Ammunition is nearly gone. Crews are depleted. Many guns have been destroyed by the attacks themselves. The soldiers have developed a paralysis when they hear the Sturmovik engines. They refuse to leave cover. They refuse to man defensive positions. The attacks have broken their will to resist. I must report that the defense of Berlin has become impossible not merely due to material shortages, but because the constant air attacks have destroyed the fighting spirit of the defenders. The final days of the Reich were marked by IL-2 attacks of particular intensity. Soviet pilots, many of whom had lost family members to German occupation, showed no mercy. Major Viktor Ivanovich Miklik, flying his 214th combat mission over Berlin on April 25, 1945, described the experience. "We attacked the Reichstag itself, the building where the fascist government had sent its orders to murder our people. I put my rockets into the windows and strafed the defenders on the roof. I could see them running, falling, dying. I felt nothing but satisfaction. For 4 years they had burned our villages and killed our families. Now we were burning their capital and killing their soldiers. This was justice delivered from the sky. This was what we had built 36,000 aircraft to accomplish. This was the Sturmovik's purpose, to bring fire and death to those who had brought fire and death to us." On May 2, 1945, the Berlin garrison surrendered. Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag. Among the units that had fought their way to the capital were the IL-2 regiments that had been dying over the Eastern Front since 1941. The cost had been staggering. Over 10,000 IL-2 South were lost in combat. More than 10,000 pilots and gunners were killed. The casualty rate, approximately 28% of all aircraft produced, was the highest of any major Soviet aircraft type. But the IL-2 regiments had destroyed more German equipment, killed more German soldiers, and broken more German divisions than any other Soviet weapon system except artillery. The Schwarzer Tod had earned its name. In the decades following the war, German veterans were interviewed extensively about their experiences on the Eastern Front. Their testimony about the IL-2 reveals the psychological impact that no statistics can capture. Major Friedrich Lang, who served with the 17th Panzer Division from 1941 to 1945, was interviewed in 1978. The Sturmoviks were worse than the T-34s, worse than the Katyushas, worse than anything. At least with tanks, you could fight. You could aim your gun, pull the trigger, and maybe live. With the Sturmoviks, there was nothing to do but hide and pray. They came from nowhere, attacked, and were gone before you could react, and they kept coming, day after day, week after week. There was never a rest. Even when you didn't see them, you heard them. That grinding noise haunted my dreams for 30 years after the war ended. I still can't hear a propeller aircraft without feeling sick to my stomach. Oberleutnant Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most decorated soldier and the leading Stuka pilot, with over 2,500 combat missions, addressed the Il-2 in his memoirs. The Russian Sturmovik was the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. I say this as someone who flew ground attack missions for 4 years. Our Stukas were precise but vulnerable. The Russian aircraft were less accurate but almost indestructible. When I hit a Sturmovik with my cannon, pieces flew off, smoke poured from the engine, and it kept flying. I once watched a Sturmovik with its entire tail section shot away continue to attack my column before crashing. The pilot was dead at the controls, but the aircraft had completed its mission. You cannot defeat an enemy like that. You can only hope to survive them. Feldwebel Anton Meisner, a flak gunner who claimed 12 IL-2 kills, was interviewed in 1985. Shooting down Sturmoviks was the hardest thing I did in the war. Not because they were difficult targets, they flew straight and level, easy to track. But because they didn't die, you hit them, and they kept coming. I once fired a complete magazine into a Sturmovik at less than 500 meters, 40 rounds of 20mm cannon. Direct hits, I could see the tracers entering the airframe. It wobbled, pulled up slightly, then dove on my battery and killed half my crew before crashing. We examined the wreck later. The pilot was already dead from my first burst. He had been flying dead for the last 30 seconds of the attack. The armor had held, the aircraft had held, and a dead man had killed my friends. That is what the Sturmoviks were. Flying ghosts that killed you even after they were destroyed. Perhaps the most revealing testimony came from General Lieutenant Hermann Plocher, who compiled the Luftwaffe's official assessment of Soviet air power. We made a catastrophic error in evaluating the In 1941, we dismissed it as a primitive machine, inferior to German designs. We laughed at its slow speed, its poor maneuverability, its industrial appearance. We did not understand that these weaknesses were irrelevant to its mission. The Soviets had designed an aircraft specifically for ground attack, protected against ground fire, armed for ground targets, built in quantities that would overwhelm any defense. By the time we recognized our error, it was too late. There were simply too many of them. They were everywhere, attacking everything. Every road, every bridge, every supply dump, every headquarters. You could not hide from them. You could not defend against them. You could only endure them and hope to survive. Many didn't survive. The Sturmoviks killed more German soldiers than any other aircraft type. They may have killed more Germans than any other weapon system except artillery. And we had laughed at them in 1941. We laughed, and they buried us. At the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, a restored IL-2M sits in a place of honor among the weapons that won the Great Patriotic War. The aircraft bears the markings of the 6th Guards Attack Aviation Regiment, one of the most decorated units in Soviet aviation history. Its fuselage is painted with 23 small stars, one for each tank destroyed by its pilot. The armor plate shows the patches of old repairs, evidence of the punishment this particular aircraft absorbed and survived. Beside the aircraft stands a display case containing fragments recovered from EL to Rex across the former Soviet Union. Armor plates pierced by German cannon, engine cowlings shredded by flak, control columns bent by crash impacts. Each fragment tells a story of violence, survival, and sacrifice. A placard beneath the display quotes Joseph Stalin's famous telegram: "The IL-22 is needed by our Red Army, now like air, like bread." But the true epitaph for the Sturmovik is found in the testimonies of those who flew it and those who faced it. The pilots who survived speak of their aircraft with the affection reserved for living things. "She brought me home," they say, describing missions from which they should never have returned. "She protected me like a mother." The anthropomorphization is universal. The IL-2 was not a machine to its crews, but a partner, a savior, a steel shell that kept them alive through hell. The Germans who survived speak of the Sturmovik with emotions ranging from respect to terror to a strange retrospective admiration. They were the best at what they did, the veterans say. We never had anything like it. If we had, perhaps things would have been different. The numbers tell their own story. 36,183 aircraft produced more than any other military aircraft in history. 600,000 combat sorties, more than any other Soviet aircraft type, 0.28% loss rate. Over 10,000 aircraft destroyed. 10,000 pilots and gunners killed, confirmed destroyed. 6,000 plus tanks. 17,000 plus vehicles. 1,500 plus artillery pieces. 65,000 plus troops. But numbers cannot capture what the IL-2 meant to those who faced it. Numbers cannot express the terror of hearing those engines approaching, knowing what was coming, unable to stop it. Numbers cannot describe the despair of watching comrades die under the grinding rain of fire, or the paralysis that set in when veterans of 100 battles broke down at the sight of Sturmoviks circling for attack. The IL-2 Sturmovik entered World War II as an object of German derision, a slow, clumsy, armored box that couldn't match Luftwaffe fighters or Stuka dive bombers. It ended the war as the most produced, most feared, and most effective ground attack aircraft ever built. The Germans had laughed at the Ilyushin in 1941. By 1945, there were no Germans left on the Eastern Front to laugh. The women in the factories had built their knives, 36,183 of them, and those knives had cut out the fascist heart. Unteroffizier Werner Kreisler survived the war. he survived Kursk, where Operation Citadel ground to a halt against Soviet defenses. He survived the long retreat through Ukraine and Poland. He survived the final battles for Germany itself, surrendering to American forces in May 1945. In 1987, at age 68, Chrysler was interviewed for a German television documentary about the Eastern Front, asked to describe his most vivid memory of the war. He did not mention tank battles, artillery bombardments, or infantry assaults. He spoke of the morning of July 5, 1943. "I still hear them," he said, his voice trembling despite for decades of peace. That grinding sound, that horrible mechanical roar. We called them Schwarzer Tod, Black Death, and they earned that name. Every day, every attack, they killed and killed until there was nothing left to kill. I was young then, 23 years old. I thought I was a soldier in the greatest army in the world. I thought we would conquer Russia, as we had conquered France. And then those aircraft appeared over Kursk, and I understood that we had already lost. We just didn't know it yet. The Sturmoviks taught us. Every rocket, every bomb, every bullet, they taught us that we were not conquerors. We were targets. And they never stopped teaching until there were no more of us left to learn. 60 years, and I still hear them. The thunder never stops. Forgotten THU and DR, the weapons they laughed at, the stories they forgot. The IL-2 Sturmovik flew its last combat mission on August 15, 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. The Wehrmacht had surrendered, and the thunder of 36,183 Sturmoviks had fallen silent over the ruins of Berlin. But in the memories of those who survived, the grinding roar of Mikulin engines never stopped. The Black Death had earned its name. Subscribe.